Excellent. So
I
you'll be
thought I
talking
could
about
take that part
Yeah. So I haven't
and hope
really
for the
written it.
best.
I haven't really written it in bits because I was writing it in the middle of the night.
I saw that. I'm sorry about that. We could have moved it.
But when I've got my daughter, my niece is coming from Australia today.
Oh, she's from. Okay, fine.
Then
Well, September, I guess.
yeah, it would have
Or
been September
August.
because then I'm off for the wedding and then I'm off to Italy and then I'm coming back and then I'm going to Ireland. And I've got all this stuff I haven't finished. So we're recording me talking bollocks. Okay.
Okay, let's just go for it. I'm sure we'll pull something out of the
But
bag.
basically, there are 5 sections, and I think let's just have a quick look at each section before we talk about it, just
Okay.
to check we've got some background
Just before, you mean, not now? Just like as we do.
as we do it. Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, excellent.
Then I'll just kick off and we'll just see what happens. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. I'm your co-host, Felicia Jackson.
And I'm your other co-host, Giulia Bottaro.
Now, over the last few years, something interesting not a good start. Something interesting has started to happen in the insurance market. We've seen insurance premiums rising really, really fast in many places in the world. At the same time, some insurers are starting to withdraw cover in particular areas, even withdrawing from...
Just say it as, don't read. You know this so
I
well.
No, I wasn't reading. That was the
okay.
problem. That's why I kept losing it. So insurers, I'm just going to say the bit I went into and then do it. So insurers, So insurers are even reducing the cover they're prepared to offer you or withdrawing from markets altogether. In California and in Florida, we've seen insurers pull out of entire markets, either because of flooding risk or wildfire risk. In the UK, the government set up Flood Re because there weren't enough insurers providing insurance to most of the buildings we've built in floodplains. So what are we actually talking about? No, that cut. What are we actually talking about? So we know it's getting harder to insure a property. It's getting harder to get a mortgage if you haven't got resilience built into the building. And that can actually mean it's a problem to sell. So it's having an economic impact. So we thought we'd talk about it. What was interesting was across 3 different conversations, we actually found out it's not as simple as insurance. It's actually about what insurance tells us about what's coming next. Oh, and sorry. Now, as our regular listeners will know, and Giulia keeps pointing out, I'm completely obsessed about insurance because...
There's no one else who is. It's only you.
It's not only me, it just feels like that sometimes, especially when talking to you. But it makes sense to be really interested in what it means, because if you can't insure something, you can't make it happen. And that's as simple as I mentioned, getting a mortgage, selling a house, all the way up to actually being able to build a new oil field, because if you can't insure the oil field and the build, the banks aren't going to give you the money for the project. So insurance shapes what we can actually do. The thing we found out after talking to Robert and Regular and Rachel, and the 3 R's was an accident, was that they were all talking about different entry points in the market. They were talking about different perspectives on insurance that shows us what this bigger picture is. It's about why risks are created and how. It's about what happens when those risks become too big for the market to actually adjust to. And then actually what the financial markets do when that starts to happen. So really what this episode is about is, if insurance is only reacting to what we see, what are we going to do about it? Where does the problem lie? Why is it that we don't see this more clearly? Did that make sense at all?
Yeah, I did. I actually just thought about the concept of oil fields. But I don't have time to read it now.
Okay. Well.
Yeah.
So do you want to make the point about the economy is always dependent on nature?
Have you already said insurance doesn't create risk? Because that was an interesting point.
No.
Okay.
So you make that point.
Exactly. Perfect. When we talk about insurance and risk, it's important to remember that insurance doesn't create risk. It's just a way to protect us from from facing it. I thought it was interesting that you pointed out that insurance are still insuring oil fields and fossil fuel projects, but then if your house is built in a high risk area for wildfire or flooding, then you're on your own. But that's, I suppose, a point for another time.
I think that's actually a really important point, though, because this goes back to what I was saying about insurance defines what we can and we can't do. And I think a big part of this problem is, and I know I go on about this as well as insurance, but it's about externalities. We talk about that in terms of business.
What does externality mean? Maybe
So
just to clarify in case somebody doesn't know.
So basically, an externality is usually used to talk about business. So it's the costs of doing business that a business doesn't pay for. So, for example, it may pay for a water supply, but it's not paying for healthy water systems that ensure that water gets into the place that supplies them. So it's not paying for the environmental consequences of action. You mentioned fossil fuel. And so oil fields, there is a cost to building an oil field, to drilling, to bringing out and extracting the oil, distributing, etc. But at no point is there payment for the environmental cost of that, let alone the carbon emissions? But what about what it does to the ocean, to the seabed, to the different ways in which ecosystems work? So thinking about externalities for a business is one thing. When you're talking about insurance, really we're talking about what are the systemic problems that exist that aren't being paid for by the things that we can cover with money.
And I think maybe this is a good point to clarify that nature and what nature brings to the economy and to society and to us is just not counted. And we talk about GDP as a metric for well-being, not really. No, I just want to delete that. Sorry.
No. But I was going to say,
I wanted
it's not
to
the well-being, it's the growth thing.
Okay, yeah. We talk about GDP is the metric for growth of the economy of countries. Now, whether GDP or not is a good metric to understand whether a country is doing well, that's a separate point, and we've spoken about it in previous episodes on economics, which we will link in the show notes. The point is, it's still the main metric for growth for the economy. And so it's been calculated that 55% of the entire world's GDP, which is equivalent to about $58 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And this number has gone up to almost 1/3, so 14 trillion since 2020. These are numbers from PwC. So this shows that we can't just afford to ignore these risks, these externalities. And I think this is important to point out because insurance then allows us to, I don't know what it does.
Okay,
in all of this.
You said something really good. I can't remember exactly what it was, but cut it there. And then I'm going to interrupt and say.
Okay, maybe I can say it again. So we just can't afford to ignore these risks, these externalities, because they have a material financial impact on our society and economy.
That's absolutely right. But there's also another point, which is just common sense. The PwC report talked about companies who are moderately or heavily dependent on nature. Everything is dependent on nature. It's that thing of, social and economic costs and operation. We don't exist without clean water and clean air. We have a food system that relies on healthy soil and the water system and the right mix of elements in the air.
And biodiversity not being dead, otherwise there's no pollinators and then there is no food.
I mean, there's so much going on with the food system, and I think we'll talk about that in another arc. But there is a horrible thing coming together at the moment with Iran and the Straits of Hormuz, which isn't talked about as much as fossil fuel, which is fertilizers not getting out of the region. And so there's real concern with the strong El Nino. So we've got stronger El Ninos because of climate change. We've got a lack of fertilizer globally because of geopolitics and all the volatility. And we've got increasingly unhealthy soil. We've got plastics in the food chain. How are we going to get all the food we need to eat to the places we need to eat it. You know, I'm not going to get into that now, but actually, this is about insurance. You have insurance in case your crops don't come in. Well, okay, that's great. But what if next time the price of your insurance for your crops doubles or trebles? You're going to put people out of business, because if they can't afford to pay for the insurance, they can't afford to do what they're doing. And I think one thing I'd love to talk about, so we used the interview with Robert Johnson to talk about water, because water, and anyone who's, cut this bit because I'm talking rubbish, the thing about water is, not only is it critical to everything we do, but the problem with it is when it's not where it needs to be, or if it is where it shouldn't be. So floods and droughts and things like that. What was fascinating to me about what he was talking about was the way in which water is actually illustrating one of the biggest, really? That's not a word. One of the biggest problems that externalities cause in the economy. And it's this idea that an environmental problem is not just an environmental problem, it's an economic one. Because the modern world, not modern world, that sounds terrible. The global financial system operates on a market basis, but markets only work if prices, the price we put on things, actually reflects reality. So if we're underpricing water, we're not paying the cost of the ecosystem services that they provide, and that means we're not necessarily actually factoring in what it's going to cost if they stop working. He has this wonderful phrase, I mean, it's hideous, but it's wonderful. And he talks about the catastrophic harmony of lots of different decisions. Because the thing is, you can all individually make what seem like really sensible business decisions, but they end up having a really bad outcome. So, you know, it's a bit drier. So all the farmers pump a little bit more groundwater, and towns are growing. So everyone builds another housing estate, which needs water and sewage and all of that kind of stuff. Businesses are trying to cut costs, so maybe they're not spending as much money as they should be on their water systems. All of those look completely rational in today's world. But if you put them together and everyone keeps doing it for 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to have rivers drying up. You're going to have wetlands collapsing. You've got cities sinking because the groundwater's been removed. I mean, look at Jakarta. It's just, if we don't put the price of what we're doing inside what we're doing, we end up paying the price somewhere else. And I know we've got so many different examples of where this actually happens. One of the ones I always go on about is Hurricane Sandy, because that was in my time. And obviously there was so much research done on it to actually understand what had gone on. It hit New Jersey, it hit New York. They spent billions investing in this, not just actually rebuilding flood walls, but they actually spent money paying to put back wetlands and sand dunes and the natural buffers that slow the impact of water on the land. And the thing is, we spend decades getting rid of all of these natural defences, but we then have to actually pay to replace them. So something that's naturally there to protect us has to be replaced by something we engineer and have to pay to build. That doesn't make any sense.
There is a cautionary tale coming from Asia, which is about the story of the Aral Sea. It used to be a salt lake lying between Kazakhstan and at the north and Uzbekistan at the south. And because of because of very intense water use for agriculture in the 1950s and 60s from the Soviet government, it basically dried up, like a whole giant lake dried up. And all the cascading effects of salinity increasing and evaporation meant that this water was never... did I say that? I didn't say that the rivers were diverted. No, I'm going to say it from the start. This happened because the rivers that were feeding the lake were diverted to provide irrigation for agriculture. And what happened is that nearly the entire sea dried up. Now the numbers are It was somewhere. Sorry, it was here. Yeah, so now the surface area of the remaining parts of the Aral Sea is less than 10% of the area in 1960. So in less than half of a century, we've managed to dry a really big body of water. And it's been estimated that to fully restore this area, they would have to stop all economic activities in the surrounding areas for at least 30 to 40 years, which is obviously unrealistic. And the thing is, people are still living there. It used to be fishing communities, and now they need to find other ways to survive. And they are doing a lot of research. They're doing a lot of communication on it around the world to basically say, A, we need to find a solution to this because we can't just displace all of these communities. But also, B, don't do it. If you have a body of water where you are, just keep it. And this is what happens when we think that natural resources are infinite, when they're absolutely not. We can't just use and then not expect to give back somehow to nature. Yeah, no, just please, I'm just chatting shit.
Yeah, no, all I was going to say was, and the thing is, this is information that we can see. These are things that we know. And sometimes you get countries going, well, won't happen to me, blah, 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 blah. But think about the US and the 1930s and the dust bowls that were created. Yes, there were droughts, but it's exacerbated by a lack of access to fresh water. These things happen all over the world. And if we're not actually managing them, how do we expect our economies to recover? There was a brilliant paper by the British economist Dasgupta on the economics of nature, built on the work of Teeb. We'll again put links in the show notes, or you can cut that out because whatever.
No, it's nice to actually quote things.
I meant me going blah, blah, blah in the show notes.
Oh.
But the thing that he was arguing is that as long as we treat nature as a free asset and not productive capital, we're not actually going to be able to manage this. And Ralph Chami just came out with a paper talking about the value of nature and the fact that we only really value nature if we kill it, which is really rather terrifying as a concept. But again, we'll talk about that another time. But it's almost at every scale, because we understand it, we feel it ourselves as people when there's a drought and we can't eat, or it's too hot, or we get rained on. I saw a video clip of a storm. I don't know where it was, but it was a high-rise building, and the rain was so intense that it was flooding into the patio and the front room of this apartment. And all I could think was, that reminds me of a Korean film I saw, which starts out with this massive storm, and these high-rise flats were all flooded, and you just think, oh, I hope that's AI. You don't want to see that is your reality. And again, it's this thing, I'm not sure we're actually seeing reality. Because
no, we're absolutely ignoring it, because we just keep, all of us are in one way guilty of it, but we just have all the food that we want, to use all the water that we want during droughts. Sure, there is things like hose pipe bans, but I mean, I don't know how much people actually respect them. If nobody's looking at you, maybe some people, you know what I mean? It's like, we're living in a world that is perhaps detached by the reality of nature right now.
Well, don't forget also, it's really important to point out that that's a very global north perspective, because we are ignoring it because we don't think it's going to happen to us. Yeah. Or because we're told this is a problem that happens far away. That's why I brought up the Dust Bowl, because things don't happen far away. What really...
Well, how many crops are going to fail this year in Europe because of the crazy temperatures and lack of rainfall?
Yeah, and
but I think in one way we are shielded from it. I don't know how. But we still can get the food. We're not going to experience a famine.
Because we pay more. And at the moment, we can do that. What worries me is this idea that we're all having a conversation about how it's, important to actually think about the wider reality. But financial models and policy and politicians aren't really addressing it. Think about planning. In the UK, you can still get planning permission to build developments in floodplains. How does that make any sense? All over the world, the actual price of buying water is often far lower than the actual cost of getting it to where it needs to be. And that's because, politically speaking, a lack of food, lack of water, these are things like increases in the petrol price that really bite in polling and voting. And, unless you can get politicians and scientists and investors and people together to have conversations about what the real price of what we're doing is, I'm not sure exactly how that's going to change. Unless, of course, we start to think about what insurance is telling us and whether we can use that as a signal.
Yeah, so I suppose in short, we can't just keep ignoring these costs because they will still be there.
That's exactly the point.
No, I was just reading the...
Oh, sorry.
No,
I thought you were starting.
No,
read
I
that
wasn't
section.
starting. No, I just thought maybe this section is done at this point because we've said these things. Right?
Yes, but
It's
then we go on to
section 2.
the protection gap.
Okay.
This is the regular...
Should I talk about the protection gap?
Yes, but I would actually say what you just said, because actually just keep that bit in, because you sounded really good.
Yeah.
Ignoring cost doesn't make them disappear. Okay. And that's another economic problem because of the protection gap.
Okay, should I just say that?
Yeah.
And that's an economic problem because of the insurance protection gap, which is the difference between the total amount of damage caused by a disaster and the amount that the insurance actually pays for. So, for example, if a flood causes £1 billion of damage and then the insurance only pays out 300 million, we are left with 700 million pounds that are not really being paid by anyone, I suppose, or they just need to be covered by someone else.
Well, they get paid by us, by the governments, by businesses, by people.
So this is when I suppose there is massive financial damage from extreme weather events where people lose their homes, their savings, and businesses have to shut, and governments and local governments go in deficit. There are stranded assets, huge risks. So yes, basically this is important because insurance is ultimately what helps an economy prop up after something bad has happened and recover quickly. So without insurance, really a disaster could turn from a physical shock into a much longer economic and social crisis.
Well, I think this is the thing that, again, we're not paying attention to. And I think why WWF's report on insurance was so important, because we don't think about that gap. We don't think about the implications. We heard about the floods in Bangladesh a few years ago. Tens of billions of dollars worth of damage and death and goodness knows what. But one of the biggest problems is if you're trying to recover from something like that and you're having to spread the cost of repair and recovery across the public sector and business and people who are already recovering from a disaster, how are you going to do that? And I think one of the things that isn't talked about enough is sovereign debt. So, there is this problem that we're all aware of, that some of the poorest countries in the world are the countries that find it the most expensive to borrow money. And they need to borrow that money to run the country or intervene in particular ways, particularly after a disaster. But if the cost of your debt keeps going up because you're having major climate disasters, you're paying more to solve the same problem. And you mentioned nature and biodiversity earlier. One of the things that, because it's an externality, the loss of the ecosystem is rarely included in the cost of a major disaster. I think the point the Regula made that I think really matters is that somebody is always paying. I think that insurance is one of the things that determines how quickly the money goes to the people who need to build back. And I think another thing that really matters, and I don't mean this politically, even though it does have a wider implication in terms of what governments are prepared to pay for. I'm thinking about FEMA's research, and I know there's been issues about the agency being, the government cutting staff in the US, and there have been various issues like many agencies that are out there with information and forward planning and scientific research. But FEMA obviously is involved in understanding hazard mitigation. How do you minimize the impact of natural disasters? How do you respond afterwards? But basically their research reflected exactly what almost all research shows. If you invest in preventing disasters, or if you can't prevent them, making the area of the disaster happen stronger, you save so much money. It's so much cheaper than rebuilding after a disaster.
Yeah, insurance should be the last resort.
Absolutely. And do you want to mention the finding? Because I love that. It connects straight from last report to the every dollar mitigated.
Oh, sure. So FEMA, which stands for Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Okay, sorry, I should have explained that earlier.
It's been doing research for a really long time that found that investing in hazard mitigation before disaster saves far more than rebuilding afterwards. So, for example, for every dollar invested in mitigation, you can save around $6 in future disaster costs, which is massive.
Well, actually, I mean, that's a fairly conservative estimate. I've seen research which shows it's up to $11. You know, and I think
suppose it depends on the area and what's
and
happened
the context and what it
yeah.
is and all of those different things. But I think we really need to be concerned about the insurance gap because it's growing. We think of the insurance gap as something that happens with these huge major disasters. But if you think about it, it's having an impact everywhere. In Australia, for example, there's research that says that because the cost of premiums are rising so quickly, homeowners are beginning to not take out insurance. And, you know, certainly in the UK, you can't have a house without insurance. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, the point is that insurance works if everybody pays their premium, and I suppose somebody can also default on payments. And but it also works because everybody pays their premium on the assumption that only a small amount of people will have damage that then can be covered by everybody's payments. But then if everybody or a lot of people happen to be victims of extreme weather events, then, well, who pays for it?
Well, I think that's one of the key issues that came up in this arc, which is that if we know that somebody is always going to be paying, how does a financial system decide who actually pays? Or does the financial system just exclude a whole bunch of people? Because, and I had you said something and I had a really good point and I've totally forgotten what it is. Never mind.
If everybody pays, somebody defaults.
Oh, yeah. No, so, I mean, Flood Re, the UK's public flood insurance, it is a prime example of that. You know, insurers weren't covering homes. So the government put together an insurance scheme that provides public insurance for homes at risk of floods. And in fact, they were in the news recently because they're actually beginning to charge slightly different things dependent on the robustness of the house or the band that the house is in. And that can be looked at two ways. One, that one house is more resilient than another, or actually that one sort of house is actually probably owned by people with more money and therefore they can afford to pay higher premiums rather than subsidising those who perhaps live in a floodplain through no choice of their own.
Should we move on to the...
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was about to say, so really that's where you actually see in action the impact. So insurance is what tells us something about the reality of the economy. And in fact, you could say it's what tells us where reality is going to hit the economy.
And I think it also speaks of the uncertainty that is going on right now because insurers spend a lot of time trying to understand risk because risk is the entire business. The point isn't avoiding risk. The point is addressing risk in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, managing it.
But everything is changing so fast and at a crazy speed, and things are so much different than they used to be, and a lot of insurance models are based on historical data, and now historical doesn't really mean much anymore when everything is unprecedented. Well, and so this shows
can I just add a story here?
I just wanted maybe to conclude
you finish
on
your
that.
thing. Okay.
So yeah, ultimately, again, insurance is, once again, as you say, uh, can it be a canary in the coal mine, just sort of
That's
telling
exactly
us,
what I'm talking about.
the problems that are going on in our society. Insurance is kind of having to deal with them first.
Well, I think what's fascinating to me is that this conversation is becoming more mainstream. And I know you think I'm obsessed about insurance, but it's actually because
Maybe
of
I
the way
am as well now. Maybe you converted me. I don't know.
But when you were talking about how insurers work on historical data, historical norms, that's absolutely what it is. It's based on actuaries. They look at the numbers, they do the statistics, they do the analysis. There's a this percent chance that this will happen. And, you know, that's what risk is. It's hazard times vulnerability. It's what the problem is it a wildfire or a drought, and how vulnerable that building or area is. And actuaries have always made those predictions. Insurers price on that, and those are our premiums, and that's how we've managed the world. But I remember being at a conference back in the 2000s when it was a reinsurers conference, you know, the people who insure the insurers. And somebody actually stood up there and said, you know, it was completely understood in the insurance industry that history is no longer a guide to the future, that they could not rely on historical data to make predictions about what was going to happen and where, because it's too volatile. Because things that would have been assessed as a 1 in 1,000 chance, you know, the 1,000-year storm or the 100-year storm, well, 100-year storms are happening once every 2 or 3 years. That's not something you can manage at the same structure and the same pricing that you did 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's just not going to work. So what are they doing? They're changing their prices. They're changing their terms. And this just obsesses me. One of the things I heard, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before and I apologize, but someone I know got flooded and wanted to use the insurance money from the flooded house to redo the building to make sure it was floodproof. And they were told no, because the insurers, the terms of the agreement are such that the insurance company could only give them money to put it back to how it was. Because if they helped them make it more floodproof, they'd be adding value to it.
My question here is, you mentioned the fact that as things are changing, externalities are changing, then they're changing the prices and the contracts. This sounds to me like they're all sort of plaster solutions that are fine for now, but really we may need something called systemic change that we've never absolutely talked about before. But, you know, it does sound like the old insurance system isn't perhaps fit for what we're going through now and what we will be going through in the very near future.
Well, I love the fact that you brought up systemic change, because most people recognize that we need systemic change to meet the challenges we face, because they're all interconnected. You know, wars are connected to resource access, and, you know, immigration, which is the big bugbear of the modern world, very much related to climate change, extreme weather, droughts, flooding. If people can't survive where they live, they're going to go somewhere else, and you can't blame someone for that. I mean, I don't care what your politics are, you cannot blame someone for wanting to be able to survive. What's really interesting about this is that our systems are not set up to be systemic. They're all fragmented. They're in silos. They have their own rules and they have their own language, and that's how it works. What's interesting about insurance is, you said earlier, a canary in a coal mine. It's something that everyone can recognize and understand. You know, bankers completely understand the importance of insurance. Equity investors understand it. Homeowners, business owners. It speaks to everybody. And if there is one thing that could potentially make everyone recognize that these things are connected, it could possibly be the insurance industry, because they're the first institutions that actually have to respond to what's changing. You know, it has, I mean, obviously I shouldn't talk about the financial system, big grandiose idea. But the reality is, if you look at what central banks are doing, if you look at what private banks are doing, and I mean commercial and investment, they're all responding in one way or another, whether it's being asked to do climate stress tests or being asked to analyse their portfolios for risk. And a lot of the ways that we do analyse risk aren't actually fit for purpose, let alone the fact that climate scenarios are changing faster than the speed at which we do those assessments. So what is happening is insurance is one of the things that's driven the financial system to recognise that the level of uncertainty is increasing. So what is that telling us about the future? I mean, obviously, building standards are going to matter more, and flood defences are going to matter more, and we're going to have to put a financial value on these things that seem a bit nebulous. And in any sensible person's mind, they're not nebulous. They're obviously sensible, and their protection and their resilience. The trouble is that the financial system is built around the idea that you can identify a financial return, a payable income stream against a debt. And if you can't actually ring fence and identify that revenue stream, then it makes it really, really hard to finance. This is the thing in the triple dividend of resilience. You know that you will get, if you build some kind of resilience project, you're going to get developmental outcomes because there will be improvement. When Canary Wharf was actually built, that was because the Thames Barrier stopped the flooding in the region. All the developers flooded in. Huge financial centre. It's a huge social centre. People live there. Huge economic boom. At the same time, flood defences can help not just protect what exists and help build new economic activity, but it also ensures protection of ecosystems, of the way in which ecosystems function. So there's all these multiple values, and many adaptation projects, which is, resilience projects in many ways, also have really strong mitigation benefits. So they cut CO2, or you build them in a way that they use renewable energy. Or I saw a picture of a building yesterday which has been built and designed so that the outside of the building has got places for nesting birds and for animals to live, because you're trying to integrate it all. I've all gone off on a tangent, as I am prone to do. But I think, to borrow a phrase from Ronald Reagan, it's the economy, stupid. That's what we have to be thinking about, because the reality is concern about the environment hasn't shifted the needle.
No,
in 50
absolutely.
years.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we need to sort of shift the narrative again and try to show people that investment in sustainability, in resilience, in nature has pretty immediate benefits to the people, to the communities around them, to the businesses, to the ordinary people.
But but that's the problem. Because the benefits are huge, but they're not immediate.
Well,
It's
some of
something
them
that plays
are.
out. Well, but generally speaking, they play out over
I'm
time.
thinking about flood protection.
Okay. But
Well,
again,
fine. They
scale
can be
matters.
immediate or not immediate. The point is that we
Definite
can't just
benefit.
live like... Exactly. We can't just think that we live separate from nature. We don't. We need to really drill into everybody's minds that we are part of the natural world, even if we are in a building, even if we are in a city. And we need to think more in those terms, because ultimately, if we keep ignoring nature, we are the ones who are going to lose from it. Because as we said before, there is no water. Well, guess what? You can't do any manufacturing. You can't do agriculture. You can't do data centers. So none of us can do
that's
internet. So, I mean, maybe that's, when parents say, I'm going to take the Wi-Fi password off of the kids. And that's what convinces the kids. Maybe when we lose internet, we will be more convinced. I'm not sure.
Well, you've got a valid point. I think
and as I said before, you can't buy a house that is not insured if you live in a flood-prone area. Wildfires are very scary, a very real concern. In places like the UK, there were loads of wildfires and I'm assuming everybody was quite surprised about it, because it didn't really used to be a thing, and now we must really expect them. So we can't. Well, I'm just wait. Okay. I'm just gonna read this and then I'm done. So basically, there are parts of the economy that are now becoming more interested in nature, because ultimately environmental conditions are increasingly determining economic outcomes.
I don't quite know where we are right now. But that was a really good
actually are
point.
at 0.4.
Okay,
I have been reading.
No,
We
no.
have covered things.
But I did
we
want
missed something.
to talk about just one thing. You can cut it out if you don't like it. But one of the things I did think was really important that we talk about is it's actually really depressing when you think about, how we haven't actually done anything about nature and climate. But where it's really interesting is, we mentioned the idea that insurance is the canary in the coal mine. So it's seeing things. But actually, one of the things that's happening is that insurers are beginning to change the way in which we do things. And insurance is potentially a lever for change. So, I mentioned hazard earlier, but I think the things that really matter are hazards and exposure and vulnerability. So we know it could be a flood, a wildfire, an earthquake. Exposure is how much is exposed to the cost of that and how vulnerable that particular area is. And the reason I mention this is there was a few years ago, there were 2 earthquakes, one in Haiti and one in New Zealand. And they were exactly the same size of earthquake, strength of earthquake. The big difference was in Haiti, it killed about 200,000 people. The costs were over 126% of Haiti's GDP. In Christchurch, 185 people died. Costs, about, I think they calculated economic losses of 30 to 40 billion, about 80% of what was insured. And the difference between those two things was building standards, building codes. It was earthquake-resistant design, and obviously a well-developed insurance system meant that people got the money quickly. So I think it's really worth thinking about what we mean by the disaster. Is it the actual event itself, or is it the vulnerability? And is insurance one of those things where it could help force us to become more resilient? Because if we can't get insurance without doing these things that we consider too expensive, well, it's just going to change the economic conditions and we're going to have to do it in the way that's more resilient.
However, it brings me back to the point of your friend who couldn't rebuild their house in a
I did say well-functioning insurance system.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So to me, that suggests that, your friend that can't rebuild their house, so then it's more protected to flooding because it would increase the value of the house. Well, this sounds like we still need to rethink the insurance system, but insurance could have a huge power to change things. And I made the point of what if insurance stops supporting oil fields earlier. And I remember being quite blown away by this concept when I found it out a few years ago. And it's still kind of not happening. Actually, I want to quickly Google insurance against fossil fuel, because I think some of them did they not sign one of those things that nobody cared about, or
sign one of those things that nobody cared about?
Oh, sorry, I'm just talking to myself. No, basically they signed one of those pacts that maybe lasted 2 years and then went to shit.
Oh, yes, you mean
something like that.
People going, we're going to do everything to get towards net zero because it's now politically acceptable. Oh no, it's going to cost loads of money and people don't like that it's costing
we
them
don't
more
care
money.
anymore. Anyway, I'm just going to stop. I will just... sorry, I have 10 minutes, but I think we are at the end. We are at 0.5.
Yeah, we are.
So
actually...
maybe we can... Sorry. I could just mention I can just bring it back to your Haiti.
Yeah, bring it back to
New
Dasgupta
Zealand.
and... Yeah.
So going back to your example of the earthquakes in Haiti and New Zealand, it shows that every society has the power to build its own resilience. Well, obviously, no, that's
if they can afford it.
I said exactly. I just want to say
we have the capacity. We have the capacity, the technology, and the knowledge.
Exactly. So
where does the money go?
Yeah. So what about your example? It shows that every society can have the capacity to create its own resilience. Is that what?
No.
It shows that every society can build resilience. Okay.
Yeah. So the point is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. I have it. I made it. Sorry. It shows that we can build resilience. Obviously, we need to have the capacity, the money, the resources for it. But there are ways to mitigate these disasters or extreme weather events.
Sorry, didn't realize you'd finished.
I just wanted to avoid chatting more shit.
But that, and actually, that is the real point. We can do this, but it takes money, it takes time, and it takes planning. And what is actually going to drive that to happen? Because, you know, I mentioned immigration earlier. If we could invest in resilience in other countries and have more livable places, then perhaps there would be less immigration. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying we don't think through the implications of the system. And I think this is, you know, Dasgupta made the point, which I said earlier, and is self-evident if you think about it. Economies operate within nature. That means within the climate. It means we have to deal with what happens with nature, biodiversity, and weather. And we know, as Robert said, that ecological systems are what underpin economic activity. Any failure in those ecological systems is going to become an economic loss, and those losses then change financial decisions. It's whether or not they change those financial decisions at a speed and a scale, and I mean multiple scales of layers of interventions that actually fundamentally make a difference. Because in the end, it's almost not uncertainty. We're having to live with the fact that everything is uncertain. What I think this whole conversation has been about is delayed consequences, because there are loads of issues about who is paying and who should pay, but the reality is in the end we all do. So we all, as individuals, as businesses, as institutions, taxpayers, we have to make a decision about how we want our society to pay for resilience. You know, do we want to restore ecosystems and reduce vulnerability and make our infrastructure stronger, harking back to the last arc? Or do we wait? And if we wait, are we prepared for the impact of higher insurance, disrupted supply chains, damaged homes, high food prices, government debt, all of these different things? You know, the real choice, I think the only choice we have, is when we choose to recognize signals so that we have or don't have enough time to respond. So to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation, and if I'm really lucky, you'll leave obsessed by insurance too. But the things I think we need to remember, and I'm harking back to your point about GDP and growth. There's lots of arguments out in the world about whether we should focus on growth. And I think that is key to the sort of almost dichotomous way that we look at the environment and the economy. We see them as separate things. One is something that needs to be protected and conserved. The other one is something we grow. But actually that distinction doesn't exist. The economy operates inside the natural world. And just because we've become good at pretending otherwise doesn't mean those costs are not going to come back to bite us.
Clearly, markets are realizing that eventually they have to respond when environmental conditions are starting to affect economic performance. We're seeing it right now, and we'll keep seeing it more. And I think we've already said the part in the bottom.
So
yeah, we've already said that.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say...
I can just conclude if you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So thanks again to our listeners for tuning in. This was the end of the arc on insurance or everything else. Sorry,
the
that
price
didn't make
of
sense.
uncertainty.
Exactly, the price of uncertainty. We are on social media. We are on LinkedIn, Instagram. We are also on YouTube. We have a newsletter. And we have a lot of episodes on all of these topics. So have a look at our catalog.
Is it worth mentioning that we're going to be taking a summer break? But
No,
over
because
the
this is
summer...
coming after this break.
Oh, yeah, good point. Well made.
I was also thinking...
Sorry. And don't forget, if there are topics you want us to cover or questions you have, do get in touch. We're always really happy to respond.
Thank you, and see you next week.
Are we going to say that thing with still shaken not burned? Because I really like that now.
Okay,
No,
sure.
too
I
much.
can say it.
Okay.
See you next week. And until then, we are still shaken, not burned.
I really like that.
Did you like it? I thought it was